Доброго дня усім, хто є у залі, хто слухає нас онлайн. Починаємо роботу в Українському кризовому медіа-центрі. Перша тема на сьогодні – важливість критичного мислення у часи.
So, the importance of critical thinking at the time of populism. Our guests are Hlib Vyshlinsky, co-chairman of the board of the Reanimation package of reform, executive director of economic strategy, Anton Yashchenko, executive director of the office of reforms of the cabinet of ministers of Ukraine, and Dmytro Yablonovsky, senior economist at the Center for Economic Strategy, expert of the Reanimation package of reforms. First, the floor is given to Hlib Vyshlinsky. Good morning. During today's briefing, we are going to present the main results of the survey that we carried out in the framework of the project Critical Thinking Against Populism, and this was initiated by the Center of Economic Strategy and supported by the Embassy of the Czech Republic in Ukraine. We carried out this survey and this project during last several months, and we did it supported by the Office of Reform of the Cabinet of Ministers. That was the customer of this survey, and the main was to identify the attitude of Ukrainians to the key reforms that became significant this autumn, and this is pension reform, education reform, reform of healthcare sector, privatization, and land reform. And in the framework of this project, the survey was carried out. 2,000 people were surveyed, and there were focus groups in different settlements and towns of Ukraine, and we carried out a series of discussions in Kiev and in the regions. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague, Anton Yashchenko, who is the Executive Director of the Office of Reform of the Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine, and then we are going to present the results of our project. Anton, welcome. Good afternoon. First, I would like to start with evident things, that the reforms on the national scale, they can be successful if there are two key components, if there are capabilities to implement these changes, and if there is political will and understanding what should be done, and also institutional capability of the state institutions that implement these reforms, and also the support of the citizens. That is really important, because for politicians it is really difficult to introduce some changes if population do not perceive these changes or to not want to accept these changes. So critical thinking and understanding how to properly communicate the position of the government, the civil servants, and others who implement reforms, this is really important for us. I represent the Office of Reforms that help the government with project management, with the proper planning and coordination and the implementation of changes. Priorities that were identified by the Prime Minister of Ukraine and by a strategic plan of the government for 3 years. And our task is to, from one side, to involve all stakeholders, to discussion, to analysis, to criticism before changes will be introduced to the parliament or will be considered by the government, and also to introduce the practice of preliminary coordination and work with all interested stakeholders for state service, and this should be business as usual or standard technology of the work of the state apparatus when we see the problem, and then we have a decision in a week, and then we rewrite this decision, and this is just going in circles, and we should start a normal cycle that is called cycle of policy analysis. And if we will have time for this, I will go in more detail on this. And now I would like to thank the Center of Economic Strategy for this analysis, for this information that we use now. And we provide this information also to the ministries, to the Ministry of Social Policy, to Ministry of Agrarian Policy, to the Ministry of Economic Development and Trade, in order to be used and to improve communication with all stakeholders on these 5 important areas established by the government in summer. And thank you, Anton. Now Dmytro Yablonovsky, senior economist at the Center for Economic Strategy, he is going to tell us about the framework, about the overall idea why we've decided that we should use this instrument such as survey, as discussion, and why this project is called Critical Thinking Against Populism, why we deal with this matter. So please, presentation on the screen. Maybe this will be a theoretic presentation.
I will give you a theoretical presentation, but it is important because you should understand what we are talking about. Critical thinking is not about criticism, it is about rational perception of what is happening in our everyday life and in reforms. So we will start with the definitions, and the first definition is cognitive distortions. Cognitive distortions means when our brains, they do not help us, but they prevent us from taking correct decisions. The system 1 is more intuitive, and the system 2 is a basis for rational decisions. So when we take intuitive decisions, the example is we cross the road when the light is green. The same concerns reforms. The first example is what we found during the discussion of perception of reforms is green pen. Green pen is a reform of education perception. People remember the green pen as a symbol, but it was not always linked good to the action. So when we discussed this in the regions, we reached the conclusion that the Ministry of Education should use this green pen as a brand of the reform, which has been already approved, but it is pending implementation. So this symbol, when a person listens to the Minister of Education, remember not only the green pen but also the sense linked to it, such as pedagogics of partnership, autonomy and independence of educational institutions, and other advantages of this reform. The next distortion is the willingness of our brain to be linked to status quo. This concerns medical reforms. When we were talking to the citizens, the situation, not surprisingly, in the healthcare is rather serious, not good. So what changes we need? We have the idea of reforms, the idea money follows the patient, and an idea to create new institutions, and people make statements that we should not waste our heritage. This is the example of link to status quo, which prevents us from moving forward, even if we know that the movement will give positive results. Definitely. The next is when there is controversy in our thoughts. In detail, the first example is the land reform. reform when the majority of citizens say that if we open the market of agricultural lands, oligarchs will buy all land? What negative consequences of moratorium? Oligarchs have already bought the land according to the shadow contracts. So this controversy should be addressed, and we should explain how reforms go in practices. The same concerns privatization reform. People are saying that it is good if the money from privatization are used to cover the needs of citizens. When we ask about strategic investors, they say strategic investor is good. We want him to come to create jobs, to provide strategies. The next most common myth, bias. When we have discussed this in the region, there was a thought that this is more about people who experience lack of information. These people, they do not have additional information, so they listen to what they like or what they forced to listen to. Social networks, they also promote this bias. If we look in the Facebook, if we have victories, someone is for treason, so we are grouped into two clusters. Some people think that some specific reform is a victory. The others form the other cluster, thinking that this reform is a treason. So this demonstrates that we are not ready to form consensus about reforms. These are examples when our brains want to help us and propose us simpler decisions, but they are not the best ones, and it is best if we switch on our rational thinking. These specifics of our brains is widely used by populists. How they use them? First, they try to create some black and white world, but the world is not black and white. There are very many colors in the world. Populists who are interested in criticism, they name everything treason, but every reform includes both risks and advantages. So as analysts of state policy, if reform has some movement, envisages some movement to the positive way, if we name it treason, then this reform cannot be supported.
So what else is used by populists? They use the weakness of our brain and our proneness to emotions. When we said about the service of healthcare, the national service of healthcare, people support this idea, but when there is negative emotional color to this idea, people start to think negatively about this institution, despite
recently they have been saying about positive things about the service. And also there are some manipulations, some wow effect. When we like someone, we attribute positive qualities despite we do not know much about this person. If a photo is shown and the person on the photo is pleasant, and if they say that this person is ready to donate 1,000 hryvnias to some charity, people believe that this person can do this. So politicians, they create positive brands, and maybe they say a lot of positive and right things, but then they manipulate, they say some things that are not true. We do not go and verify these things, whether in Canada, for example, 92% of agricultural lands are in state property. So the majority of this is true if we are speaking about agricultural lands, 92%, but it doesn't relate to agricultural lands. And the populists, they use this idea because we do not verify this as should be done. So also there is an instrument that is popular among the marketologists. So if I say ha ha ha, happiness around, maybe you will have an association with some brand or with some positive emotions. And populists, they work not with the positive things but with negative, and they repeat things and connect some negative statement to reform, and they say that this reform is a genocide, this we will all die, and they say that reform is genocide, and in the result, when you ask people on focus group something about reforms, these people do not know the mechanisms, but subconsciously they have this word genocide as an association. And when you start to speak with people and explain reforms to people, people understand that this is positive reform, but this subconscious attitude prevents people to get more information and to form more critical ground opinion on the reform. And also lastly, about the brief conclusion. So the support of reform that we saw from our analysis, populists, politicians who are populists, they try to create obstacles. They form their political capital on negative things, because negative attitude is an emotion, and it can be easily connected to the attitude to reforms. And whether the initiative of the power, positive or not positive, they try to convince that this is all treason, and in the result, people, even if they know something about reforms, they think in black and white, and they do not want to think and get more information about reforms. And when we start to speak in focus groups about the components of reform, and Hlib will tell us about it, and we test these reforms in the research, and people really support reforms. And I would like to give the floor to Hlib, and he is going to tell us about what Ukrainians think about reforms and what they are afraid of in the course of the implementation of these reforms.
Thank you. The colleagues will now demonstrate the presentation on screen. We see now the methodology which we used. As I have already said, GFK Ukraine conducted a phone survey to mobile numbers, which allowed to cover the citizens of Ukraine in 4 cities. Focus groups were conducted, 2 groups per each reform. The survey was held from July to September. Most of interviews were conducted in August, so the theoretical error of
So they assessed the reforms during the interview, and we had on the whole more than 800 respondents that assessed the reforms, and it provided the error in the framework of 3.4%. Speaking about the awareness on reforms, we will see it in more detail about each reform. We have different levels. We see the focus that was made by the government and the promotion of pension, land, and educational reform, especially concerning pension reform. There is a high level of awareness. Those people who know at least something about the reform, whether people believe that they know all the components of the reform or they wanted to get more information about the reform of education, and also the reform, privatization reform. Now there are public discussions on this. The level is lower, but here we should say that if we speak about privatization, this issue of state enterprises, it is not at the high level of awareness among people. If we speak about pension, land reform, or medical reform, people, they encounter more with these reforms, and if we're speaking about state enterprises, less people know about what is going on in state enterprises, and it leads to the fact that in this area, all these distortions Dmytro told us about, they are more common there. And the same we saw in land reform, when the biggest number of stereotypes was among urban population. They do not have proper understanding how it is going on, that people have their land plots, but they cannot really properly deal with them. So 2/3 know something about the reform of education, and some of them, half of the citizens want to get more information about the reform. People understand that this is critically important for them, but the information about what will be changed is not enough. Also, we see that in the result of this low level of awareness, people have contradictions in their mind. Some people think, how can they believe the state? They are disillusioned that everything is not going so fast and so well as they wanted, but still they want that the state controlled it and do things as usual. So what we see in the reform of education on the whole, if we are speaking about the support of this reform, the level of support is high among those people who support the idea that the schools and local government should manage education budget. And also, from one side, you may see that there is a big share of those who believe that if we provide more responsibilities to local government, they would steal more. And also, if the principals of the school will get more, they will not be able to properly distribute the funds. But if we create a mathematical model in order to see the correlation between those who support reforms and those who disagree, that local government will steal or that principals won't be able to manage funds properly. So we see that the changes from Soviet system also that people that children at schools, they should not only get information, but also they should have more freedom of thinking, and this is 80%, more than 80% of people believe that this is the case. So about the reform of education, 41% believe independent experts, 37 believe more to teachers, and 29 they believe parents and from parents associations, and 22% believe directors of schools principals. So in Ukraine, people understand that independent experts, their opinion is more valuable. Also pension reform. And here we see an interesting situation. Only 22% never heard of this reform, and the level of awareness is the highest. And 60% wanted to know more about this reform, and we understand this clearly, and it shows that successful reforms are should be really supported by good communication. And a pension reform is a complex reform. Each pension is calculated separately for each pensioner. There are many rules. Formulas are really difficult, and this change of the system leads to the fact that the introduction of the new approach and taking into account the number of years, this is not common for people, so a lot of things should be explained to people, and not all the experts who work with economic topics can clearly explain to pensioners what is going on with pension system. And also people, they believe that everything is too difficult from one side, and state debt should be limited, and we should not borrow from next generations, but at the same time pensioners are really poor, and people want to retire early, and as Dmytro said, that when people want early and high pensions and do not want to really deal with these issues. So people, for people, pensions are more clear than the work of the state enterprises. And we see that the matter of justice, of fairness is really important for people, and it identifies the attitude towards pension reform. You may see that 84% agree that the increase of the number of years and those who paid longer to the pension fund, they should get the pension earlier, and 2/3 believe that the increase of the requirements to the number of years will create the situation when people will contribute more to the pension fund, and this is the logic that the government follows in the framework of this reform. Also, we may look at the statements concerning pension reform. Both those are for and against. So also entrepreneurs and farmers should pay to pension funds because they will also get pensions, so 91% agree. But from one side, 83% due to populism, populists say that pension age shouldn't be increased because people won't live up to the pension, and so 83% support this idea. And about the same number say that pension system should be balanced, Ukraine should not accumulate debts, and pension pension age will be higher, and they say that we shouldn't create debt for our children, and Ukrainians, they die earlier, and there is some sort of contradiction that appear concerning the pensions. And also people agree that the pensions, they should depend on the salary and the number of years that a person worked, and also that the pensions should be more modern. So 41% believe that concerning pension reform, we should hear the opinion of independent experts, 31% to hear the opinion of those who now work, and 22% to listen to pensioners. And it shows the priorities of people and the opinion of different stakeholders. So also healthcare reform. The reform, this is a complex reform. There are a lot of components that will be introduced over the next 3 years. And 55% want to know more about this reform. And also the stereotypes that the opponents of the reform spread. They say that hospitals closed and there is a reduction of personnel, but you know that there are many hospitals that are financed where people spend a lot of money for health care, but everyone says that in the constitution health care in Ukraine is free. 88% support that people should be able to address to family doctors, and in case of need to be referred to specialized doctors, and also that the state should pay for family doctors and emergency help, and there will be an opportunity, and also co-pay that is envisaged in the strategy till 2020, and money follow the patient, when the patient can choose doctors, and hospitals, 82% agree with this idea, and quality hospitals will have the money to update equipment and make repairs. This is also 85% of support. Concerning the risks, those risks the opponents of reform say about, they have less support. 2/3 believe that villages they won't be able to afford the hospitals, and also if the money will be provided to the national service, the money will be stolen. So people believe that no matter where the money is, whether at the local level or at the state level, at the centralized level, so in Kiev, so the money will be stolen in Kiev. So, and the risk, and also in the ministry also they believe that there is such a risk, that if there is co-pay, there is a risk that the patients will overpay for services that are not of high quality, and we will need the proper control from the side of the National Service of Healthcare in order to provide these quality services. Also about 41% more than 40%, the biggest part, they believe that they listen to NGOs who care about patients, the biggest patient organizations, Patients of Ukraine, and the organization of people who live with HIV. They are those corrupt forces in the system of healthcare. They understand that these organizations really protect the rights of patients, so 40%, and the independent experts, they 40%. So the land reform, concerning the land reform, the awareness is rather high, 90%. The reform have been discussed for a long time, and people know a lot about the reform. And also people want to know more about this reform, but some of people, they do not want to know about this reform because they do not have land plots in their ownership. And also people have some contradictions. It is good when the owner works on his land, but if the land is bought by some oligarchs, that would be bad, people believe. And also the risks and benefits. What are the benefits if the moratorium is lifted, the moratorium on the land, on agricultural land? Two-thirds believe that if the moratorium is cancelled, then the owner will invest in the processing, and this will stimulate activity, and those who own land, they will work on it, and this will yield more profit on long-term prospect. And more than 60% believe that the cancellation of moratorium will give the opportunity to get loans, and the bank will be ready for this, and farmers will get more money to develop their business, and the owners will work more on their land, and now some people who lease the land, they plant those cultures that exhaust the land, and more than 60% they believe that today's situation is not optimal, and the opportunity to sell and buy land, and the situation when the owner will work on his land, that this will improve the situation. And the risks faced, that people do not properly understand the procedure of buying and selling rate, and this can increase radar attacks and fraud. 77% believe so, and also that the oligarchs will buy all the land, and the farmers won't have money to buy land. 73% agree with this idea. And the Prime Minister met with the representatives of the biggest bank in order to discuss what credit products can be provided by the banks in case of introduction of the land reform, in order not to face the situation when small and medium-sized farmers are ready to buy the land plots they work on, but the banks cannot provide such credit products to buy this land. And whom people believe in this reform? So medium and small farmers, 46, the landowners 36, 34 believe in independent experts. And the heads of agro holdings, 12%, and only 12% listen to so about privatization, 11% heard of it, and also the people believe that the oligarchs will buy the enterprise at a lower price, but many people believe that privatization is better than state ownership. So what are the main advantages? People agree that politicians steal money of state enterprises and then by this money finance their elections, and fair politicians cannot win, and 84% agree with this. Private enterprises invest more in technology and create employment. 74% agree with this, and the same number of people believe that there is a lot of stealing in state enterprises, and private ownership will prevent this. Also, the risks and contradictions in the mind of our citizens. From one side, everyone agrees massive corruption in state enterprises, and despite 25 years of this corruption, 86% believe that this can be overcome without privatization if there is such a will. And next time we will carry out a survey to ask people in what methods can be used in order to do it. And the second risk is conditions of privatization, that they can be made for oligarchs, and this is a real threat. And they tomorrow there will be a draft law number 8066 that will be considered tomorrow at the Supreme Council. Also, people want to listen the opinion of independent experts, those who fight corruption in this area, and in people's minds, there is direct link between state enterprise and corruption, and they are ready to hear to this group and to potential buyers and investors and to private entrepreneurs. 19% they are ready to listen to this group. So what should be done in order this reform get more support? This is the speaker who is trusted, who speaks about reform, right channels of communication, and in the result it can lead to better understanding and proper support of the reform. So Anton will tell us several words as he asked, and then you will be able to ask questions. Thank you.
To continue the last slide of Gleb's presentation on the simplified algorithm of gaining success in implementation of the reform and getting support from the population in general, I'd like to say that this corresponds to the practices and experience which we have during 9 months of the Office of Reforms operations with the Cabinet of Ministers. Not only ministers communicate the changes, and sometimes the changes are not perceived by the population, and this information could be communicated to experts and citizens via other channels, via groups which are listened to. This differs between reforms. In one reform, this could be experts of the sector, for example, healthcare sector. In other, for example, privatization sector, maybe anti-corruption experts who now are combating corruption, such as watchdogs, or who are making more systemic efforts by drafting laws. The second, what I want to accent is emotional perception of reforms. Now we undervalue this threat. And telling the truth, both reformers inside the government and independent experts or volunteers, they do not communicate reforms good in terms of emotions, because we can see that on the example of elections all over the world, we see how this is shocking when emotional arguments they win in the comparison against the rational arguments. For example, when there are emotional arguments such as land is our nurse, it gives us bread, something which you own, which is your native, you can understand it, but we should also master the technology of reasoned thinking, of forming, and also we should learn how to invoke positive emotions, for example, towards such technocratic reforms as land market or privatizations. We have already used the results of this analysis as concerns channels of communication, and the second is about key target audience, which we should address, and I hope that this approach will become a standard technology of government for government operations, and selecting reformers to the 10 ministries and the secretariat of the cabinet of ministers. We will be using this technology for staffing, for hunting for civil servants. Thank you. Colleagues, are there questions among the audience? Thank you for very interesting report. I'm Жанна Рябуха, represent American Ukrainian University Concordia. You are talking about communication channels, but working with experts, how do you see this activity? What reforms, what methods of cooperation with experts will be used? Now we are again at the level, in the general plane, not just of general statements, not specific one. I will give you an example. When we only we're working on the submission of the draft law on pension reform to the parliament, we received, the government received very many resistance from the industry, from the sectoral experts, and the Office of Reforms was instructed to find out what is happening. So we had meetings with all key experts. We found out what they are concerned about with, and we articulated the roadmap for the second and third level. So the criticism was not against the draft law submitted by the government. It was the critics was about the second and third level, which were absent. So we created two parallel processes, and we agreed how we will be working with the second and third level. We held several meetings. We developed the roadmap, which was approved by the governmental meeting this autumn, and it is been implemented by the National Bank, by the Cabinet, by the National Commission on Financial Services. This is the example when we not only we were not only debating, not only fighting by arguments to find who is the winner, but to reach a decision, to make a decision. Roman Vyshlinsky, UCMC. I have a question to Mr. Yablonovsky. He was talking about the theory, maybe. The biases you were talking about, they are not because it is because easier for people to believe that everything would be good. How 1 year before the elections we can in parallel explain people the truth, which is unpleasant, and at the same time to carry out election campaign. As a marketologist with 12 years of experience, you can just divide into good and bad guys. We can I do not want to name someone populist and someone not populist, but we want reformers to be present in the government, and elections may be of significant impact on the membership of the government. So populists, it is easier to criticize what populists are doing indeed. I'd like to add 2 scenes. The first is about the observation, my personal observation. When we change the government, we do not change the agenda of reforms. If we compare the coalition agreement of 2014 and strategic plans of the government, we can see almost the same agenda. We go in the same direction. The risk of some slower reforming is available, but the direction will be preserved. The second, what we are addressing is the development of capacity building, institutional capacity building. We want reforms to be coordinated, planned, not by external experts or volunteers, but by civil servants inside the ministries. To this end, starting with 2014 and now, and several years, several following years, the civil service reform would be ongoing. We will see the civil servants who have been selected by new procedures of selection and who will be working according to the new rules and new practices, and during elections we will have more efficient governmental apparatuses which will be more efficient in implementation of changes. I'd like to say that there were several examples when stereotypes start to conflict one with another. I would like to use it more than it is used now. Because this format is similar to Eastern combat arts. When you use the strengths of your enemy to your benefit. This is the problem of post-truth which we experience now when we are talking about some reform, for example pension reform. We do not want to increase the pension age, but at the same time we do not want to borrow from our children. Or in the land reform there are risks which we are talking about, and there are, on the other hand, a stereotype in our society that the eldest people should be protected, their interests should be protected. So the most owners of land plots, they are people elder than 60 years. So there's a conflict of stereotypes when it appears, and it seems to me that in the framework of the facts and truths, people decide that there is no truth. So people will feel that we do not want to debate with everyone. There are arguments for one side, there are arguments from the other side. Well, let the government do what they want to do. So tactically, this tool could be used actively, because everything which is done by someone with a bad goal sometimes may have a positive effect if it is searched correctly. Unfortunately, we do not have time for questions now. Please ask your questions of record.